Shema grana gauna gyalla hillen orola ho. Head non gros na callen banya hi hororio. Hagio hillen orola ho.
G'day viewers. So I'm back with another quick sword review, this time of some Hanwei Scottish themed swords. So what's so exciting about Hanwei Scottish swords, you might ask? Well, let's find out. So this is the old model's Hanwei basket hilt, which I've discussed before, and problems with it, just to recap, essentially that it is really too short for most full-sized people for, Silver's perfect length or even McGregor's measurement for a broadsword. The hilt is pretty tight. If you've got large hands, you do tend to bang your knuckles into the side of the hilt, even without gloves. And it is a reasonably heavy, chunky, ill-balanced lump of metal. And so, well, we have a few of these banging around in the club. It's not a sword that I generally recommend to people. However, I happen to have a student who is quite small, with quite small hands, who likes a heavier sword, and he's also quite short, so he needs something that's a little bit shorter. So I thought for him, hey, actually, a Hanwei would be a really good choice. So he went out and he bought one. But in the meantime, Hanwei have revamped the model. Now, I knew that had happened, but I'd never been really inspired to go and check it out. But what he came back with was this. So this is the revamped Hanwei model Highland broadsword. Now, just a word of warning, this was a sharp one, and sometimes with Hanwei you do get minor aesthetic differences between the practical and the sharp versions, and sometimes major ones, like the Hanwei practical mortuary hilt is a terrible toothpick, whereas the Hanwei sharp mortuary hilt is actually a very, very nice sword. But anyway, so he's given this to me to blunt down for practical use, which I've done, but I thought I'd take the opportunity to compare it to the old model. Now, the first thing is that it is longer. So if I compare them hilt to hilt, you can see that the new model is a couple of inches longer, and it was in fact even slightly longer before I took the tip off. And that makes it more or less perfect length for a full-grown person. So this is now long enough to be good for silver, and for, as I say, McGregor's measurements for how to measure a broadsword are about the same. So that's a really big improvement. Now, second improvement is the basket is bigger. Okay, my hand bangs into this one. It does not bang into the side of this one at all. It's about a centimetre wider. The basket, the leather liner, is actually very, very nicely done. It's a nice, really nice liner in there, and that's going to, it's thick enough that it's actually going to help when you get the odd thrust coming in there. This is the antiqued version, so it's kind of antiqued, and it's quite nicely done. It's got Andrea Ferrera written on it, and all that. But overall, it is a significant improvement on the old Hanwei model. Now, the weight and balance of this thing is pretty well exactly the same as the old one. Both of them weigh about 1.5 kilos. This is just a shade under, and both of them balance around about 10 centimeters from the cross, like so. Things I don't like about it. So let's start with a minor one, and that is the grip. Now, the grip on this one is sort of fake shark skin. It's quite grippy, which is nice. It looks pretty, which is nice. But the grip itself is really too small and too round for my personal taste. I like a grip that actually fills up my palm, and I like it to be reasonably sort of rectangular shaped, so it gives me a good sense of where the edge is. This is too small and too round for me to feel particularly happy with it. Now, the practical might have a different hilt. Certainly the old practical does have a reasonably bigger, squarer, leather-wrapped grip, so that might be different on different models of this thing, and you could replace it. And it's not bad enough to be a deal breaker, okay? With your hand in that basket, it's snug enough that you can really tell where the edge is, and like I say, it's nice and grippy, so that's kind of okay. The other thing about it that I would count as a slight negative is, again, the weight and the balance. So this weighs 1.5 kilos and balances about 10 centimeters from the cross and feels like a crowbar. Okay, this is a really heavy sword, and it's slightly unwieldy, and I've never been particularly happy with the old model's feel in the hand. This is one of my custom broadswords. It weighs 1.5 kilos and balances 10 centimeters from the cross, exactly the same. And yet, by comparison, this is a fast and agile sword, which I can swing around really quite well, which just goes to show you that weight and point of balance are not particularly useful measurements. Whereas this just feels alive in the hand, so it's really, really nice. This is my Donnelly ribbon hilt. It weighs 1.5 kilos and balances 11 centimeters from the cross, so it's actually slightly more tip heavy. And it's not quite as agile as my silver sword, but it feels really nice. It wants to swing. It swings with authority, and it feels really solid in defence. And is certainly, despite being fairly weighty, it's a fairly wieldable sword. Now the new Hanwei weighs 1.5 kilos and balances 10 centimeters from the cross, exactly the same as all the others. And yet, it's not quite as crowbar-y as the original version, but it is certainly a weighty sword. It feels very tip-heavy, and while I quite like that, and it would certainly, if you're doing silver or you're doing early broadswords, so page, and you want something that swings with authority, this certainly fits the bill. It is not the best balanced sword in the world. And if you're going to bout with it, you would certainly want to know what you were doing, and you would probably, like the person you're bouting with, to be wearing relatively heavy padding, because if you start swinging this way it's supposed to be swung, it is certainly going to develop an awful lot of thump. Okay, so really the difference between this and the custom swords, it's not the weight, not the point of balance, it is the distal taper. Okay, there's a lot more weight up this end of the sword, which makes the whole thing feel a lot more clunky and tip heavy than with the other swords. But for a full-grown adult male person, now, I'm going to give this the thumbs up. I think this is actually, it's a major improvement in the old model, and it is certainly good enough. Okay, if you want a decent basket hilt, you know, quickly, that you can just buy off the internet, and there it is. This is actually improved enough off the old model that I would recommend it to people. I would not recommend it to all people. Okay, if it is, as I say, a weighty sword, and there are certainly people in my class that I would say, no, you're not going to be able to pick this up, let alone swing it around. But for an averagely burly man, it's not that bad. And so I would say, you know, as long as you are reasonably skilled in controlling your blows, and you're all wearing enough solid protection, this is a perfectly decent practical sword. So the other one I want to talk about is the one that people continue to mislabel a Claymore, but the typical Scottish two-hander. Now this one is a custom job from Craig Sitch of Manning Imperial, one of the best armourers on the planet. He made this for me more than 20 years ago, and it is still basically untouched, not a scratch on the blade. It is the most brilliant piece of grinding, as you can see there. Lovely hollow ground with that central ridge to keep it reasonably stiff, exactly to museum specs from an existing example in the National Museum of Scotland. Can't tell you exactly how much it weighs. It's more than 2 kilos, and which is as far as my scales go, but it is extremely wieldy despite the weight. Very well balanced. It balances about 3 centimeters from the cross, and it's a beautiful thing, and it gets used. And if you look back on some of our early Spadoni videos, you'll see Richard killing large numbers of us swinging this thing around before we got the proper Spadoni trainers. Now, I was interested in exploring this particular weapon further. My basic theory is that Alfieri's Spadoni system seems to work really well with it and explains a lot about the design. So that's kind of what I'm planning on working on. So I wanted to know, how can I get myself some of these that I can swing around with and kind of equip a class with. Now, I managed to find a Hanwei Claymore reasonably cheap. And this is it, okay? And again, this is the antiqued version, possibly why it was going cheap. And I'm going to say, look, you know, the fittings, the crossguard is really nice. The langettes going down the blade, they're very nice. Handle's well done, nice pommel. Overall dimensions are good. Not a bad sword. It is, however, in its current form, completely unwieldable, okay? For strength training purposes and learning how to swing the Spadoni around and going with the weight of it, probably okay. But for sparring purposes, it's even though, you know, this is, again, a sharp version, not that it's particularly sharp, I'm going to, you know, blunt that down. But it's just too heavy, okay, to really swing around, and much, much heavier than the real thing, which is the important thing. So, what am I going to do about that? Well, basically, I'm going to turn it into a feather. I'm going to take off most of the blade on either side of the central thing down to about there, just before the fuller here, and turn it into a Claymore feather and see if it then weighs and balances something more like the real thing. And here it is. So, that took me exactly 1 hour and 15 minutes of actual work in sort of 10 or 15 minute drabs spread over the course of a couple of days. But I'm quite happy with the result. It is now feather shaped. It's got nice thick edges. If you're interested, I just cut the sides off freehand with an angle grinder, used a grinding blade to try and straighten the edges up, and then used a belt sander to, again, further straighten up those edges. Now, they are still a bit wobbly, but I'm sure from this distance you can't tell. It looks pretty good. How does it feel? Well, if I compare it to my nice one, it is now a lot closer to the real thing. This one is still nicer. This is still a little bit too heavy, a little bit too forward weighted, so I certainly haven't taken too much metal off by featherizing it. In fact, I will probably at some point thin the blade down towards the end there quite considerably, because the point of balance in this is still a couple of inches too far forward. But it is much, much better, much, much closer to the real thing, and certainly usable. And so, I'm going to go and use it.
Wy mes jock airs, dir me cordially and lana, dur chillon the bike to jor, bol and boris gawalia. Nil shenla niga fall, nil shenla snive imagine, nil shenla niga fall, so la sword toss a yelly.
Chor me lavisteach me focus, dear me brisha skillinger, he dirt she lumsy she's can board is be a golden shug imagine.
Nil shenla niga fall, nil shenla snive imagine, nil shenla niga fall, so la sword toss a yelly. Aligado he arati, kroto vista isto hat to go when it took your listen to na car. Vas a golden shop, imagine. Nil shenla niga fall, nil shenla snive imagine, nil shenla niga fall, so la sword toss a yelly.
So there you go. Now, to finish off with, and just to satisfy Tim's curiosity, I usually have a bit of a tipple when I'm doing these things, and so Tim suggested I should tell you what I'm drinking. So today I'm having some Young Henry's Cloudy Cider. Young Henry's being a local brewery in Newtown, in fact just up the road from the Newtown branch of Staccato, in fact. So when you get this on tap in the local pubs, it's really, really fresh. And it's you know, lovely and aptly. not in any way cloyingly sweet like a lot of particularly European ciders are, and we've just had 2 35-degree days in a row, and so on a horrible muggy afternoon like this, extremely refreshing. So, highly recommended Young Henry's Cloudy Cider.